the American proletariat was in the back pocket of the capitalist system, you did have a world. If you looked at at capitalism on a global basis, you saw that the Vietnamese peasants were the real proletariat. A joke, in my opinion. I was horrified by these kind of statements, or statements very similar to what I've just said, that that the people of the third world were the proletariat, and that mainly peasants, I may add, incidentally, which was, in my opinion, an absurd equivalence to the proletariat, industrial proletariat, on which Marx banked in England and in Western Europe. And that, in a sense, you know, the first world was the common enemy of the third world. This later became a Weatherman ideology, although I doubt that Marcuse retained it very long. I can't say. All I know is that I challenged him at New York University at that particular point. I had known him before that. And questioned this type of position. But it became a very widespread sentiment in some respects, and a whole theory in still other respects. Idiotically, André Gortz, the inevitable André Gortz, out in France, came out with a book called The New Strategy for Labor, I think that was the title, in which he tried to say that on the university, students were the proletariat. They were the new proletariat that was being formed by the university, and, you know, that they should not regard themselves as what they really were in the main. That is to say, a middle-class stratum in the society. And created an absurd analysis between the rising student movement and the working class, parallel between the rising student movement and the working class, be it in France or be it in the 1930s in the United States, and the other powers that be. So that a theory was formulated increasingly, if not overtly by Gortz, increasingly by SDS people, that you could now apply Marxism to the student movement. That's to say, you can bring this whole increasingly dubious, at least for the 1960s ideology, into what was basically a populist movement, trying to unite all oppressed, you see, without making the little fine distinctions between proletarian and capitalist, wage worker and exploiter. You see, wage earner and exploiter. And bringing this very, very artificial ideology into SDS. And this was very much promoted by Greg Calvert. He once sat in my home in around 1970, finishing off a bottle of vodka and saying that he felt personally almost responsible for the degeneration of SDS, because he and Carl Davidson, another of the SDS honchos, created a committee to educate SDS into this kind of class analysis, which was very artificial, a very artificial class analysis. The students were not a proletariat. They were going on, and they did go on ultimately, to enter into professional careers. They weren't workers in a factory who felt their destinies lay with the factory, the kind of working class that I had known in the 1930s and in the 1940s. Workers did not expect their children in the 1930s and 1940s to go to college. They expected them to come into the factory. You know? They were hereditary as a working class. Later on, the expectations began to change with the GI Bill and the like. And certainly by the 1960s, the great majority of students were not intent on engaging in a wage labor versus capital relationship. They were going to become managers or professionals, or in fact capitalists, if possible. So that image of the campus and of the academy was preposterous. And by the way, André Gortz changed his point of view, I am told, at the very time that the French version was translated into English, so that it was obsolete for him in any case, although he had a good many crazy ideas about the working class, which I don't want to go into because I had a long discussion with him when he came to Buffalo and found out that he was running around looking for the American proletariat, and that a whole bunch of Marxist-Leninists were leading him in Buffalo into a plant that was being closed down, the Bethlehem Steel plant, in which they only had a few hundred workers left out of many thousands who'd been laid off, and he was investigating the condition of the working class in America. Let that be. But in any case, Calvert and Davidson and others began to inject this kind of more particularistic interpretation of the American condition into SDS. And in a sense, while making it seem more radical, we're actually diluting the true living relationship and a radical living relationship that SDS, or the student movement generally, could have had toward the American people, who were at that time puzzled by everything that was happening. Didn't know where they stood on the Vietnam War, didn't know what the hell was going on in the country. Additionally, coming out of the Beat movement in great part, and even to a certain extent, believe it or not, the peace movement. We had all kinds of peace organizations whose names have totally faded from the history books, but that were very important, like the Committee for Nonviolent Action, CNVA, which was a very, at least photogenic movement, because then you had young peaceniks with beards, long hair, ponytails, and wearing jeans, swimming up to nuclear submarines and, trying to occupy the nuclear submarines out in the various naval shipyards. They were the first, by the way, hippie types that I had ever encountered. They were the long hairs, they were the beards, the bearded ones. They were the ones who wore sandals instead of leather shoe wear, because many of them were vegetarians. They were the ones who wore the jeans that were later to become popular, as well as snick workers in the South who wore the jeans of the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers. So this counterculture too began to emerge, not influenced by the New Left very much. And this counterculture tried to express itself in a new way of life, counter literally to the suburban world from which many of the young people came. They had been raised on a diet of cookouts, on suburban lawns, on trading partners between suburbanites who gathered at cocktail parties, at this smug self-satisfaction, and Dr. Spock to lend a hand. And I admire Dr. Spock, of course, but I'm saying that the way in which his ideas were interpreted were basically not so much permissiveness, but the idea of sheer spontaneity, let the child's spontaneity come out. And they were out to express themselves as well against the culture of their parents, the suburban culture of their parents. And they wanted to, in a sense, and I use the word critique because it's too strong a word, they were repelled by that whole suburban horizon, and therefore went into a negative reaction to everything that existed in the suburban world. Thus, many of them became vegetarians in reaction to the cookouts of hamburgers. Still others, after having been subjected to the ordeal of playing baseball in little leagues under parental supervision, insisted on leaving home and breaking away from all of that, dressed in as children in the tidy clothing of suburbanites, everything so neat and spick and span. They tended to gravitate toward informal clothing and toward a sense of appreciation of the body, a greater degree of sensuality, of sensuousness as such, in clothing, free hair, the whole idea of liberation. Sexual liberation, dietary liberation, residential liberation. They tended to inhabit the worst slum areas that whites could live in, for example, in New York, like the Lower East Side, where they intermingled with the Puerto Ricans, and walking partly dressed, often without shoes at all, on the hot concrete of New York, which struck me as being a little curious, and expressing their sensuality, and finally through a free sexuality, through nudity, and communal living became very important, because the suburbs were notable for the extent to which they were atomized. The lawn actually stood as a kind of wall between one suburban house and another suburban